My name is Michael Guyette, publisher of the Lead Lag Report, and joining me for the hour is Jeff Schultz. Jeff, it's been a while since you and I chatted. Appreciate your time here, but introduce yourself to the audience. Who are you? What's background? How'd you get involved in the cannabis space as an attorney, and what are you doing currently?
Sure. Can you hear me okay right now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Sure. I'm a partner at Foley Hoag, which is a regional law firm with offices in New York, Boston, Denver, and in Paris and Washington, D.C. We're one of the very few sort of larger law firms in the country that represents cannabis businesses with a pretty robust cannabis industry practice group that spans corporate, M&A, regulatory, IP, employment law, real estate, et cetera. And I practice pretty much across the entire space, predominantly in the United States. I'd love to say that most of my clients are located in New York, but I think it's going to be a minute before that really happens, as this rollout just lags and lags. But my practice is sort of evenly split between representing operators and investors in the space. And my background is I'm a private fund lawyer. I've been a hedge fund and private equity fund attorney for 17 years, and I've been in the cannabis space for 5. I got into the space in 2018. I joined a fund called Navy Capital, which launched as a hedge fund in the cannabis space, but quickly became a hybrid fund because we started to deploy quite a bit of private capital into early stage companies in the US and Israel and other countries. And it was right around when Canada legalized. And we actually started to pivot out of Canadian companies, if that's telling of anything. But I do some advocacy work as well on top of all that. I spend some time in Washington and up in Albany and work with a gentleman named Weldon Angelos, who I think you've had on the show before. And I do some pro bono work for him. King Weldon spent 12 years in federal prison. He was sentenced to 55 years in federal prison for selling 3 ounces of weed individually on separate occasions for a total of $900. And it's completely ridiculous. He served 12 of those 55 years and was released by President Obama and then subsequently pardoned by President Trump. And I find Weldon to be the most effective advocate for federal decriminalization and regulation of the cannabis industry in the United States. I'll sort of just follow Weldon around wherever he goes and whatever he does in this industry because he's that good at what he does. So I do some more advocacy on the local level as well. I live in New York. So last night I was out in Islip meeting with some of the retail license winners and local officials, county officials, and talking to them about opting out of these towns. Just, we'll get into it on New York, but almost every municipality in Long Island, Nassau, and Suffolk County opted out of retail stores, except for roughly 10. Of those 10, only 4 of them actually have retail or industrial space, anything that's not residential. So there's 40, 50 licensees in Long Island, and there's nowhere to really go. There is one store open, but that's more the ground game. So I do some advocacy at the most local level possible, and I guess at the highest levels on the federal level as well.
All right. As they mentioned operators and investors, I'm going to make the assumption that there's a much different level of activity on the private economy side than the public markets, right? Given the hemorrhage that's gone on for a lot of the MSOs on the stock side. Has there been a pretty steady amount of activity in terms of investor interest in the cannabis space, despite the public markets going through a nasty bear market, or are they tracking pretty closely?
They don't track as closely as I think other industries do, or should, or would. There's still plenty of activity. I think the valuations the valuations in private markets are not. They're obviously lagging, right? I mean, it's mark to market's an interesting thing, and it's like the one way to look. I've said this for many years. You have to look at publicly traded U.S. I hate the term, but plant touching companies that are operating pursuant to a state license is what I would call plant touching. Those companies trade on the CSE, which is a phony exchange. It's not really a public exchange. These are not really public companies in the sense that they're extremely inefficient. There's no volume. I would treat them as quasi, VC investments. And if you want to look at them every day, you can. But no, we haven't seen it. It's clearly tracking, but private markets are not falling as hard as the public markets are down 90%. But people are still raising money privately. And this will continue to go on, right? As each state legalizes, right? New York is legalizing. People are waking up. There are high net worth, ultra high net worth individuals who probably would not have deployed or hadn't deployed capital into the cannabis industry, but because it's sort of, it's next door to them, it's right outside them, it's in their face, it's ubiquitous at this point, and it's clear that it's legal. I think that a lot of people have gotten over the stigma and gotten comfortable with deploying capital into private companies. And I think that's just going to continue as states roll out, right? Texas is going to go through that in probably a big way. And so there's, private markets still exist. The M&A and capital raising for private markets is really slow. It's just not completely dead the way that the public sector is.
Other than the obvious answer that the government's always slow, why is it that on the state level, but more importantly on the federal level, things have been brutally slow? I was going through your feed. I shared at the top here the 10 years on the Safe Banking Act, right? 10 years.
Crazy.
So lay that out for the others. First of all, explain what the Safe Banking Act, is, why it's important, and what the hell's taking so long.
So, the Safe Banking Act it's a piece of legislation that was introduced a decade ago that would provide a safe harbor for FDIC insured institutions and insurance industry operators to provide their normal services to marijuana-related MRBs, marijuana-related businesses, companies that own cannabis licenses, and ancillary businesses as well. It affects everybody. But it was basically, in short, it would allow banks to bank cannabis. It would allow insurance companies to provide coverage. And those two things are related. The history behind that is closer than you may think, right? And it's because this is all about anti-money laundering at the end of the day. And the irony of the issues that Republicans are pointing to, which we'll get to, is rich. The point is banks lending to cannabis companies were at risk, in theory, under the law, of violating their FDIC insurance policies. And if you're a bank and you're a commercial banking entity and you lose your FDIC insurance, you're out of business. And that's a term in their insurance policies, on the FDIC policies. Part of why they legalized banking with insurance is because of the FDIC insurance policy. That's the hook there. When it was written, we can get into the uplisting conversation as well. But, when it was written, the people who wrote it, who I've spoke to many years ago before I wrote my first op-ed asking for requesting for uplisting publicly, I wanted to make damn sure that I was right, that it didn't allow for that. And I spoke to the authors of the bill, and they said they put this term, sort of financial services, which is what is being allowed under safe banking. That definition ties to the definition of financial services in the Dodd-Frank Act. And that definition, Dodd-Frank, explicitly excludes broker-dealer activity, FINRA members. It talks about commercial banking and commercial banking only. So why is this so hard to get done? This is so simple. It started around safety. The concept of safe banking, or the purpose of passing safe banking, I think it's molded and been reshaped by stakeholders from all four corners of the industry and from the advocacy world. On the finance side and the publicly traded company side, sort of the corporate side, if you will, it's people who want uplisting. And they want that added to the bill. Then you have other groups of people saying this isn't about safety. This is about small business ownership and lending. And people have gone in all different directions and torn this bill into pieces. I believe that it hasn't passed. And I think the broader picture around federal legalization, why are we not seeing a real movement at all, despite overwhelming uniform feeling in this country that cannabis should not be criminal? And I say that because I don't think there's a uniform opinion about how it should be regulated. I think that everybody agrees that it shouldn't be criminal and that it should be regulated in some form or fashion. There are some people who think it should not be regulated at all. I totally disagree with those people. But the reason why I feel that way, I think it's taken so long, is because notwithstanding the fact that 70% of this country agrees that it should be decriminalized and regulated to some extent, politicians understand that this is not a dinner table issue, and no one's changing their vote based on a candidate's position on cannabis legalization. Very, very, very few people are doing that. Right? So politicians know that. Senator Schumer definitely knows this. He gets to talk about it all day long and say he's going to do this, that, and the other. And great, he gets a feather in his cap for doing that, even if he's not actually taking any action, or apparently not taking any action, just talking about it all the time. That's good enough right? Because his failure to act is unlikely to cost him any votes next year. And that's a problem. So it's this sort of redhead stepchild of an issue that, even though we all agree on the policy, nobody really cares that much at the end of the day. And that's a very sad state of affairs.
What would it take to get urgency? I mean, it sounds to me like, not to go dark on this, but, if somehow it became even more clear that, without the Safe Banking Act, you end up having, more criminal activities because, it's cash, right? So you go to the dispensaries and, you can rob them easily, right? And I mean, is it as simple as you just need to have some really scary, videos of crimes that, could be prevented from have the Safe Banking Act?
I mean, I wish that was the tipping point, but we're already past that because that's going on a very regular basis. So that's falling on deaf ears, which is also, again, very frustrating to see criminal activity, robberies, people stealing from dispensaries and cultivation facilities and the like. That doesn't seem to be persuading anybody, right? Because we get into these sort of secondary issue. Really, it's the Republicans that need to be, I think, more educated on the issue of what safe banking is and what it does. And to me, it's mostly an issue around education. And I try to spend my time, and I have over the last 5 years, on meeting with elected officials to help them understand like what is really going on in the industry today and what safe banking would do to solve some of the problems facing the industry on an immediate basis. And there's a laundry list of them. Safe banking is just a very tiny incremental step forward. It's the very least that they could do, which would sort of it's not going to open some floodgates. I don't believe in that. I don't think that all these companies are going to go list on NASDAQ the next day. That's not going to happen, but it should open up capital markets ever so slightly. I think you see a lot more lending activity, and I just don't think that they understand. I don't know what it's going to take. I really don't. It's overwhelmingly obvious that we need it, right? And now the concern becomes, are companies really actually just going to continue to go out of business? Is this industry going to die on the vine until we see something, even as little as safe banking? And I think we're at the point where, a friend of mine in the industry who's the CEO of one of the publicly traded companies said to me, he said, this is not a nice to have. This is a need to have. It used to be a nice to have. This is a need to have. We are failing. We're in trouble as a business. It will become insolvent if we don't have solutions in the next, weeks, months, or years. It's really weeks or months at this point. The industry's getting slaughtered. So I think that message needs to be told by anyone who has a real stake in this and say, this isn't something that we just would like to do here. We're dead without it.
Which party do you get a sense has maybe more relative urgency when it comes to safe banking and just, cannabis on the federal level, Republicans or Democrats?
Oh, I think it's a tie. I don't think either party feels a real sense of urgency. I think if they did, they would have acted by now. And, there's a lot of talk. There's a lot of bluster. There's a lot of let's go home and research this, but nobody has acted. So I have to say right now, I don't think either party is treating this as an urgent issue whatsoever, which is unfortunate. And that applies not just to federal legalization, not just federal regulation, but that also applies to criminal justice reform. We've seen that Trump passed the First Step Act. That was a big deal. Joe Biden has allowed certain people to stay home on CARES Act that were incarcerated for low-level drug crimes. That's fine. He announced, he announced a statutory request to the DOJ and then forward onto the HHS to review scheduling in cannabis. That's a long process, but he did it. But he hasn't done much else. There are 2,700 people who are currently incarcerated at the federal level for cannabis crimes. Not every one of those people probably deserves to be released because they've committed much more than just a nonviolent low-level cannabis crime. But a large number of them should be. And the president hasn't taken action on that, notwithstanding the fact that we presented the clemency plan to the White House pardon chair's office last summer. So we haven't seen much sense of urgency from anyone on this issue.
I mean, I feel like I need to smoke just because it's so depressing to hear that there's no progress. And I think that really, it's like, I feel for the plight of the entrepreneur. I'm an entrepreneur myself, right? And you can't control the value of your portfolio. Right. That's what everybody's claiming to, right? And it doesn't help to control your destiny when the federal side is not even allowing you to, take credit card transactions. What about things outside of safe that maybe would push the industry and the discussion a little bit forward? Any other kind of legislation that would be a net positive, even if it's just a baby step?
I think outside of SAFE, there isn't a lot of, I don't think there are a lot of realistic incremental policies that are being proposed at the moment. It's the big issue is now rescheduling, right? And that's the one that's happening. That's underway. That is when the president, I think it was last September, announced, he issued a press release, he spoke, he has a written statement on it, and there's a formal statutory request to review scheduling of cannabis. So that's happening. They have to do that. HHS and DEA have to undergo that process because they have been asked by the president to do. They can't ignore that. So the process is underway. Where it's at, well, you'd have to be on the inside, and very, very, very few people know what's actually happening or where it's at and where that progress is. I am not one of those people, right? But I have a sense of what's happening, and I can guess as to the timeline there because this is a political issue. And we live in, a politically inspired world. And I think that we'll probably hear something before the next election. I don't know if that's in December or January of January 24. It could be in October of 24. It might not happen at all. I'm not sure. But if I were to make a bet, I'd bet that we're going to hear some sort of announcement around rescheduling prior to the election, but we won't see any action on that until the next administration takes office, whoever that may be. So, and that's sort of in line with, politics 101. Let's announce the big policy change, but don't do anything because we have a big election coming up. So don't do anything that's going to blow back on us. But let's just announce it for now that we're going to do it. And I could see that happening. The problem with rescheduling is that's not just some sort of panacea. It's not going to be descheduled. I would like it to be, right? My personal opinion is great. It should probably be descheduled, but that's not realistically what's going to happen here. It's likely to move to Schedule 2 or Schedule 3. Schedule 3 is bad. Schedule 2 is catastrophic. And the most catastrophic event would be a move to Schedule 2, and then the president and and everybody takes credit for it and pats themselves on the back. And the only thing that will happen if we move cannabis to Schedule 2 is that the pharmaceutical industry can now sort of take over. And that's it. And people need to be aware of that. They need to be aware of that right now. This isn't going to be like the big bang moment that we all wanted, right? Oh, cannabis is legal. Nope. And even a move to Schedule 3, the only difference between 2 and 3 with respect to the existing industry is that 280E will go away. That's a massive, massive event. Massive. Companies in the cannabis industry everybody's still treated like a drug dealer under 280E. You cannot deduct any of your SG&A. You can only deduct COGS. That's the only expense that you can deduct right now if you're a cannabis company because of Section 280E. A move to Schedule 3 would disapply the cannabis industry from 280E. That's going to provide an immediate, massive lift. Private, public, everybody. That's a huge deal. However, a move to Schedule 3 does not do anything for criminal justice reform. It does not legalize anybody's current business. If you have a license in New York, you're not all of a sudden legal. You're still operating illegally under the Controlled Substances Act. So we need accompanying legislation with the rescheduling to actually federally legalize. And that probably looks a lot like alcohol.
So you mentioned New York quite a bit. I'm in New York myself, not too far from you. And in the DM, you said, one of the things we should talk about is what the hell is going on in New York? Now, I will preface this by saying I am blown away by the number of dispensaries that have popped up just where I live. I don't know. I don't think that's what you're referring to. But that thing you referenced about iSlip and retail stores, that wasn't news to me. And I don't quite follow the space that well. So I'm curious to have you expand on that. But what is going on with New York?
What is going on with New York? That's a great question. I said we should talk about it, but I didn't say I had the answer. No, I got a pretty good idea of what's happening here, which is, look, this is what happens when you decriminalize a certain activity or behavior and you don't regulate it concurrently. This is what happens. People are going to step in. Oh, that's, whatever. Robbing gas stations was illegal. All of a sudden, it's no longer illegal, but we're not going to regulate the manner in which you can rob a gas station. Well, everyone's just going to rob all of them and take all their money. There's nothing you could do about it. We have thousands of these smoke shops all over the city. They're all over everywhere. I was in New Jersey on Monday and they were all over the highway. It was bizarre. I just haven't seen that I haven't seen that, the ubiquitous unlicensed shop the way that I have in New York anywhere else. But so we have thousands of these stores. We now have a social conundrum of the war on drugs should be over. But on the other hand, why don't we just treat this like any other business that requires a license to operate? If you tried to open a nail salon in the city without a license, you'd be shut down the same day. Put a streetcar.
Okay. So I'm clear. So what you're saying is that basically there's a ton of these smoke shops that are opening up that are unlicensed that people are going into, and the product might be fine, but they're circumventing the state legalities, so to speak.
Correct. And claiming that they found a loophole in the MRTA, which is the enabling legislation for adult use in New York. There's no loophole in the MRTA. The loophole is that there's no enforcement of cannabis commerce at all. That's the loophole. Nobody's doing anything about it. It's not legal. It's just not being enforced. People are going to do what they're going to do, and people want to make money. And there are people that don't care that they should win a license, that they should have a license, should be operating in a compliant fashion. But there's a whole group of people out there who are saying there's no consequence. And now there are some consequences, but unfortunately they generally don't have a lot of teeth. And I've suggested, if you go through the history of my feed, I have suggested that the state and the city adopts regulations for landlord liability. They've done that now, right? If you're a landlord, how difficult is it for you to check whether your tenant has a valid license to engage in the business that they're engaging in? It takes 5 seconds. It's not that hard.
Well, it's funny. That's exactly where my mind went to. It's like, why, I would think there would be liability on the real estate owners, but you're saying that's not the case.
It is now, right? And both the city and state have passed legislation and adopted regulations for landlord liability. So it's happening. People are getting fined, right? And this is not the only solution by any stretch. There's a law in LA and it's not working that well, right? Similar law for landlord liability. Even if it's a prophylactic measure and it's successful in a prophylactic fashion, that to me is a success, right? Anything to slow down the proliferation of smoke shops is the first step, right? And the state of New York believes that the best defense is offense. They issued 463 retail licenses. Unfortunately, they gave them to people generally who don't have the capital to secure real estate and open. So that's a huge challenge in and of itself and a whole conversation unto itself. But, it starts with the fact that we've got thousands of smoke shops and they present the most competition to the legal market than anybody else. And it's really tough. I have people say to me all the time, why would I go to one of these stores when I can buy an eighth of indoor California cannabis for $25 at the bodega? Why am I going to buy, a $50 or $40 eighth at the legal dispensary? It's led to some interesting dynamics and outcomes. And I'm very, pretty involved in the New York market rollout right now from many different angles. One thing that surprised me is the percentage of sales representing edibles in New York. In most states, flower, which includes bagged and jarred flower and pre-rolls, represents roughly 65% of all sales. That kind of hasn't really held up here in New York for a couple of reasons. Edible sales have been a disproportionate amount of sales in the legal market. I think that's because people are sick of eating nerd ropes and terrible unregulated edibles that they're getting in these smoke shops. They want legal, regulated, titrated edibles that they know are safe. And that's led to like a ton of edibles sales, more so than I think. Well, so when we start to see the data publicly, I think you see an outsized number of edibles being purchased, more so maybe than in other new states.
Yeah, I can imagine that's frustrating for those that are trying to do it the right way by, going through the whole process of getting the license. What is that process even like? If somebody wanted to, the right way, the legal way.
That's a really good question. I'd like to know myself. It's been very haphazard, this rollout. And what they did initially, what the state did was they passed legislation that said that if you had an operational hemp license for the last 2 years, we're going to grandfather you into an adult use cannabis license. So this was in part to help out some of what they consider to be distressed farmers outside of New York City. We live in a city state, and that political dynamic is extremely relevant here in New York in cannabis, where, there are politicians who are trying to take care of their upstate farmers, and there are politicians who are trying to take care of people in their underrepresented communities in and around New York City in the metropolitan area. And those are two different groups. The way the state looked at it is let's do a solid for all of the distressed farmers. And if you got a hemp license and you got sort of screwed over by the whole hemp program, we'll give you a second shot at glory. Here's your adult use cannabis cultivation license and processing license. And if you were harmed by the war on drugs and the prohibition of cannabis, we'll give you a license for retail. You come from a community that's been disproportionately impacted by prohibition. And those are the two prongs, right? It's really important to see that dynamic in those two groups of people. It's very much what's coloring the program. So they gave out 282 cultivation licenses, but everybody's capped at 25,000 square feet of canopy, flowering canopy. And that's in legislation. And then the OCM, through regulation, created the CARD program, Conditional Adult Use Retail License. This is a sort of social and economic equity driven program that does not appear in the legislation at all. And that's why there's an injunction in place, at least temporarily. But the Office of Cannabis Management created a program that did not exist necessarily in the bill. And that gave out so far they've given out 463 dispensary licenses to people who have both a New York State criminal cannabis conviction and have a successful track record of owning a profitable business. That's a difficult prong. It could be an immediate family member. So that was the criteria for winning one of these CARD licenses at retail. And they initially said they'd give out 150, and then they gave out 300. And then they gave out last month 463 of these licenses. 23 of them are currently open out of 463. There's a variety of reasons. It goes back to, naturally some of the people, if you fit the criteria, there's a pretty high likelihood that you didn't have the capital to go open a dispensary, which is not exactly cheap. It's not like opening a coffee shop. You need at least $1 million to open a dispensary. That's not a $50,000 or $100,000 venture. It's an expensive business to launch. On top of that, they are regulating the New York industry identically to liquor. The original, and I was having a conversation with somebody at OCM about this 2 weeks ago. He reminded me that the original draft of the adult use bill was an amendment to the ABC law in New York, which is the alcoholic beverage control law. It was just an amendment that said it'd say liquor and cannabis was the amendment everywhere. So we're sort of adhering to this. There's dogmatic adherence to the liquor law and cannabis, and you can sort of read between the lines how that happened. But here we are, and they have rules around vertical integration, prohibition of vertical integration. So there's a reason why you don't see a Grey Goose liquor store. You don't see a Diageo superstore. You got the Total Wines out there, but that's not a brand. You never see a liquor brand owning a liquor store. It's just a thing. That's because they have a 3-tiered system. You have distillers and manufacturers, you have distributors, and you have liquor stores and bars. They're regulating cannabis the same way. And because of that, you can't be on the cap table of a dispensary in New York if you own any interest directly or indirectly in any amount, no de minimis exemption, in cultivation, processing, manufacturing, or distribution anywhere on the planet. So you can't fund a business. If I was interested as any high net worth individual looking to, say, finance one of these stores and say, here's $2 million for 49% of your dispensary. That's the capital you're going to need to get up and running and hire everybody. Well, if that's me, and I'll give you a very attenuated circumstance, which is sort of cartoonish, but if my wife owns an interest in a VC fund that in turn owns an interest in a California cultivation company, I myself am not allowed to finance and own any equity in a New York dispensary. They're concerned about the undue influence that could be exerted over somebody. I can't even own 1% of that dispensary. So the rules are extremely strict. They followed the liquor law very closely. The problem is cannabis industry is 12 months old. Liquor is 95 years old or 90 years old. There aren't that many. There's the pool of investors. It's not big. There's just not that much capital to go around. So we've been stifled. The launch of the program has been stifled by the regulatory framework and by the lack of funding generally that should have been available to these people. And so we're seeing a super slow rollout. And now we're seeing lawsuits galore, which have temporarily enjoined OCM from issuing new licenses, from allowing stores to open. And the only real winner there is the illicit market. Pretty crazy.
There's a
lot there.
Yeah, utterly wild. Yeah, utterly wild. Let me just reset the room for the remaining 15 minutes. So everybody please make sure you follow Jeff Schultz here on X. If you want to come up and ask questions, click that bottom left mic request button. You had mentioned Texas before. I'm sure you're probably tracking all the various states and which you're going to allow, not allow, and timelines. Anything that's on the horizon that you think might be sort of a real big deal in terms of a particular state approving recreational cannabis?
I think the next on deck is Ohio. In the November election, there's a ballot initiative. That's next. I mean, it's not a small state, probably, a fairly big deal, but Texas is coming down the pike. It's going to happen. And Texas is going to be huge. It's Texas. I don't think they're going to give out many licenses. I think it's going to be for a very few select group of very well-heeled, well-connected, and well-financed applicants. In a state like Texas, I can see that happening. The demand there is, like any other state, it's going to be huge. But we're already I think we're at 23, 24 states now that have legalized adult use. Hitting 25, I used to think was the big deal. Doesn't seem like that's as important as I thought it would be. But we already have 38 states with medical cannabis legalized. But on the state level, I think we're just going to see some more progress. I think Texas eventually, Ohio is coming up very soon. Hopefully we see Florida go. And, it's just going to be it's going to be one after another. Which Minnesota, somebody made an interesting comment to me this week and said, New York really screwed this up when the cannabis industry is more excited over Minnesota legalization than New York. New York should be the biggest market in the country, maybe number 2 to California. And people are more interested in pursuing the Minnesota market right now than New York, which is, it's just sad. It's just sad, but it's just state by state. I think I'll get excited when Nebraska legalizes. I think that's when we hit when we hit everybody. They might go last. But one thing that we're seeing develop aside from state legalization is some not even grassroots, it's becoming very organized, but an attempt to harmonize the state regulatory frameworks in anticipation of federal legalization. That's going to be important to enabling interstate commerce, right? And that to me is almost more important than each state legalizing. I forgot when Mississippi ended their dry status, but I don't think it was until the 50s or 60s, might have been the 60s, 30 something years after, alcohol prohibition ended. So it's going to be a while before everybody legalizes, but that's not the concern. The concern is, can you move product from point A to point B across state lines? And, that's going to be good for some, not for others. But we can't do that until we have a harmonized regulatory framework, right? New York has already addressed it in a way, as a very sophisticated way with their CBD rules, right? They're going to do the same thing for cannabis, which is you can't just tax California cannabis at 100%. That's unconstitutional. The state of New York can't do that, right? If it's being shipped in. What they can do is say your California cannabis is not allowed to be distributed and sold here in New York unless it meets all of our cultivation, processing, manufacturing, packaging, and labeling and marketing standards. That's something that they can do. So until we harmonize all those rules, interstate commerce is going to roll out slowly if and when that it will happen. But the question, it could be 10 years away, right? Just to level set. But if and when that is permitted, we're going to have to see harmonization of rules. That's the kind of thing that is that I'm watching carefully and very excited about, in addition to what appears to be the liquor industry's full-throated endorsement of federal legalization this year, very publicly. The Wine and Spirits Wholesalers of America, the WSWA. WSWA represents the trade organization representing the liquor industry, and they've been very vocal and very public about their support for federal legalization and a regulatory framework that looks just like them, just like what they're doing. So I think you have to keep an eye on that and look at the two-tiered system for liquor. And if you're deploying any money, you're involved in this industry, you got to keep your eye out for that. Really important.
Look at the questions in the thread. Listeners asking or saying, I'm reading reports on tighter controls of high potency cultivation and supply. If true, how do you think it could impact the current industry?
There's a couple things here. It's another sort of symptom of federal prohibition that we don't have the research and education around cannabis potency, what it does to adults, what it does to underage consumers. And we need that information, right? And also, I think a lot of consumers, and unfortunately sort of driven by marketing and sales at the dispensary level, go to a store, like people actually pick their product based on THC percentage. It doesn't necessarily get you higher. A 26% THC flower is not going to necessarily get you higher than like 18. It probably will more than 10, but it's not really a 1-to-1, right? It's the entire profile of the plant, right? You have to look at cannabinoids and terpenes that all impact the high that you have. It's not just pure THC percentage. And it's priced that way, unfortunately. I wish the industry would just move away from that, but higher THC cannabis is more expensive, which is silly, right? Because nobody goes to a liquor store or a bar and says, give me your strongest booze and charge me the most for that 151 or that Jaeger or the Goldschlager. That's extra. No, that's ridiculous. Nobody does that. They consume and purchase based on taste and price and among other things, but it's not like ABV equates to cost or price. So it's a little silly. The potency issue is a real one. I think that prohibitionist groups have clung to that issue, and you're hearing more and more about it because we do need to do some research on whether high potency cannabis is causing psychosis in certain people who are predisposed to it. Not everybody, but there probably are certain people who are predisposed to a lot of negative effects of consuming high potency cannabis. The problem is we can't find that all out until we legalize it. You have to move it off of Schedule 1 so that we can do the earnest research, medical research into the efficacy of the plant and all these other concerns. So yes, I want to know the answer to that question too. I don't want that happening. I don't want my kids smoking weed when they're 16 through the age of 21 and it melts their brain. Of course I don't want that. Nobody wants that. How do we prevent that? We have to legalize it so we can research it properly. And so we research it properly. We don't really know what the issue there is, but I think it's something that people are clinging on to.
What are some of the more interesting legal cases or things that you've been working on that, either have been surprising, just take us inside baseball as far as what's going on day to day for you?
I'll tell you what I found to be very interesting at the moment and currently is negotiating deals. What we're going to see is a lot of New York real estate people, a lot of landlords in New York, the non sort of SL Greens and Blackstones of the world, high net worth individuals, family offices will end up owning a very large stake in the retail tier of the New York cannabis market. And I say that because what is happening and developing here in New York is these people are getting funded. The retailers are getting money. What's happening is they're reaching out to landlords. They're looking at space, and those landlords aren't SL Green and Blackstone because they won't touch cannabis. But if you're just an individual that happens to own a building and either you have no debt on your building or you have a sort of friendly lender that's okay with cannabis, you might be open to having a dispensary tenant. And what a lot of these landlords are saying is, I'll take the tenant. This is a great business. Really interesting. Oh, you don't have any capital? Can I buy into your license? And they're buying into the license and signing leases. Negotiating those deals is really interesting right now. I think it's one of the more interesting things that we're working on. And that's not just New York, it's New Jersey. It's in several states where social equity is being rolled out and frankly everywhere because there just isn't a lot of cash in this business, in the industry nationally. But money's still good and money is still being deployed. There is money out there, just not a lot of it. And there's some very cool ideas that I would love to tell everybody about, but I can't. But this market's going to be super interesting. There are people working on very creative business ideas in New York and New York City in particular around the cannabis industry that haven't really been rolled out anywhere else. Partially because of the regulatory structure and part because it's just New York. But there are going to be some very cool businesses that we just haven't seen yet in other states that I'm very excited about. I just wish I could share more details, but you're going to see some new stuff coming out in New York.
Yeah, I mean, you're at the forefront of a whole fascinating part of the economy. One thing I haven't asked you is just in general, you alluded to it, right? Money's still going there, but it's less and less. Is there any kind of link between cannabis activity and interest rates in general? I mean, it's how is sort of the macro impact?
Rates are already so damn high. It's pushed them up to the usury ceiling. Yes, it's had the broader market. First of all, it's become very obvious. Rates have gone up in cannabis. They were already astronomically high. They've gone up even further. One of the interesting things that's happened is money that was going to be lent by the state of New York to these social equity retailers was going to be on a floating rate basis. And they announced this program like I don't know, 2 years ago, I'm like, hi guys, have you talked to anyone about this? These rates are going to skyrocket. And they have. So there's all kinds of crazy implications from the broader markets and the sort of global macro picture implicating cannabis. One of them is the cost of capital was already outrageously high. It's gotten even more expensive. It's not getting cheaper. It's also pushed people out of cannabis who said, I don't need that risk premium. I don't need that anymore. I can get I can get 10% on anything. I don't need to lend you money at 12 and I don't need the extra 2 points. It's now 18. You know, if that loan was 12% 2 years ago, that loan's 18% now. It's gone up dramatically. And in many cases, people have just walked away from cannabis because they can achieve that low double digit yield doing something much safer. And that's part of why we've lost some of the money in the industry, which is unfortunate. The other thing is just the cost of doing business, and inflation generally has impacted the industry, which is already cash strapped. So in some cases, I think it's just like the last straw for some people. It's also just made it much more difficult for startups to get to scale and build a healthy company because the cost of everything from soil to labor has gone up quite a bit. So yeah, no one's immune to it. And then you see inflation with happening contemporaneously with the price of flower on a wholesale basis, the price of products just dramatically dropping almost everywhere over the last, call it 3 years or so. So the price of everything has gone up, except for the product that is being wholesaled in this industry, which is going down while the input costs are going up. So it's sort of a very unhealthy dynamic.
Yeah, no, super interesting. Super interesting. Yeah, I can't imagine the kind of, you get margin compression from everywhere, aside from just even the licensing aspect of it. I mean, just to your point, right? The inputs versus the outputs. It makes it very unappealing, but still, obviously, there's a lot of growth potential because there's right. That's not,
and you need to play within. You just got to play within the framework and the rollout of what's happening, right? Like New York cultivators are growing greenhouse or outdoor cannabis, and they're selling it for prices that exceed indoor cannabis prices in other states. The cost of production is a fraction for outdoor greenhouse, and for a true indoor facility. You know, if you can sell greenhouse flower, the wholesale price of greenhouse flower in New York is $3,000, $3,600 a pound. You know, as low maybe as $2,800. $2,800 is still a lot, and $3,000 is much more than most of the indoor flower in the rest of the country, at least on the West Coast. So, yeah, if you understand the dynamics here and understand that that's temporary, that might last for another 1, 2, or 3 years, and where a lot of businesses in this industry have gone wrong, they have failed to acknowledge the fact that that's going to change and it's going to change fast. The price of flower is going to come down, and there'll probably be an oversupply one day. But right now, if you're a New York cultivator, you can move your product at $3,000, $3,500 a pound right now. You're crushing it because your cost of production is really low because you have to grow it in a greenhouse or outdoors. So there are ways to make money if you understand the industry well. And they don't seem to be in the public market at all, which is unfortunate right now, for now.
Jeff, if we want to track more of your thoughts and work, where would you point them to?
I would point them to my Twitter feed, and I would just link it to my LinkedIn or our firm's website is folioag.com. We have a cannabis and law blog where I try to publish as frequently as I can. It's just on our firm website, but links to all of that are really on my Twitter handle and then my LinkedIn profile. We didn't even get to talk about music.
Well, music. Let's talk about music. What do you want to talk about?
Oh, what? Tell me what are you writing these days?
Oh, no. I'm waiting. I'm working on this song called Credit Event. Just given everything that I'm seeing. Listen, we'll save that for another conversation, and maybe I'll jam live on. But anyway, I do have another conversation coming up here. Everybody, please make sure you follow Jeff Schultz here on X. Again, this will be an edited podcast under Lead Lag Live. Hopefully, I actually advertise that podcast because every single time I've tried to promote a podcast on cannabis, I actually get a rejection.
Oh my God!
The whole thing is just mind numbing to me. I can't even just talk about it, or promote it on the ad side. But everybody, please make sure you follow Jeff. I'm going to have this as a podcast soon enough, and I appreciate everybody that's joined. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's great.
Yeah, all right. Cheers.
Cheers.